Hi everyone, this is week 11. We are Stacy, Samara, and Guadalupe, and we will be presenting on middle adulthood. The first article we're going to talk about is midlife as a pivotal period in the life course, balancing growth and decline at the crossroads of youth and old age. Collectively, we don't have as clear of an understanding of midlife as we do younger and older life stages. So the authors talk about misconceptions of the life stage and what's actually happening in middle age. The idea of midlife was created about 150 years ago, and back then people did not live as long as they do now. So at the time, midlife was considered to be like 25 years old to 45 years old, whereas now we consider it more 40 years old to 60 years old. But even this consideration of midlife is questioned because that's such a large age range, and people, even within the same age, really vary in their health, well-being, and functioning. So in the article, they say midlife may be better considered in terms of roles, timing of life events, and life experience. The authors refer to the National Survey of Midlife in the United States longitudinal findings in order to better understand the physical health, cognitive functioning, and well-being in the middle years of the life course. They share some common misconceptions about midlife. A huge one, which I'm sure we're all familiar with even before these readings, is the midlife crisis. So that middle life is a time of stress and unhappiness, unfulfillment. And they share that the truth is really only 10 to 20% of people in the US reported having a midlife crisis. And they refer to another study about the midlife crisis from the UK, which says that about half of those who experience midlife crisis attribute it to inner turmoil or angst associated with getting older. And for the rest, it's tied to events such as divorce, job loss, or health problems. And those are things that can occur at any age. So it's not necessarily specific to middle adulthood. And they share that those who do experience a crisis in midlife due to inner turmoil or angst, that these are usually people who have upheavals at other times in their lives. So it actually has little to do with the developmental stage itself. Due to these misconceptions about midlife, it's very common for people to not want to be in middle adulthood, and when they do reach that point, to wish that they were younger, which is referred to as youthful yearning in the article. While these are misconceptions, it's important to note that there are still, of course, challenges in midlife as there are in all stages. So the juggling of multiple responsibilities and emerging physical and cognitive signs of aging are definitely things that people struggle with. But people don't talk as much about the fact that there's a lot of opportunity to peak in midlife in terms of earnings and position at work, leadership and family roles, decision-making abilities, and self-confidence, and contributions to the community. The authors focus on three major tenets of a lifespan developmental perspective relevant to midlife as a pivotal period. The first one is multidirectionality, which talks about how some processes are on a downward trajectory while others are on an upward. For example, as we're getting older, our cognitive and physical functioning decreases, but our life satisfaction actually increases. This knowledge of the future satisfaction is really important because it provides a sense of optimism that the future is brighter than the present may be. The next major tenets that the authors talk about are variability and plasticity. So variability refers to the fact that some people age more rapidly than others do, and that it's common for some people in middle age to have cognitive performance that's more similar to young adults, whereas there are people who could be the same age and have cognitive performance that's more similar to older adults. When we look at why some people age quicker than others, something that's talked about is socioeconomic status. So, for example, those who have low SES in terms of limited educational attainment show poorer episodic memory and are less likely to engage in stimulating cognitive activity on a regular basis. But a study also shows that for those with lower education who frequently engage with cognitive activities, that they have memory that's actually comparable to those with higher levels of education. So that demonstrates the idea of plasticity, that there's an opportunity for change and enhancement beyond existing levels of functioning or performance. Next, the authors talk about protection and resilience, the fact that there are ways to slow down or minimize aging. So, some protective factors include an engaged lifestyle, physical exercise, social support, and positive beliefs. One that they really talk about a lot is a sense of control. And some risk factors are smoking, poor diet, obesity, and loneliness. And based on the National Survey of Midlife in the United States, they found that a combination of multiple of adaptive factors is protective in reducing 10-year declines in cognitive and functional health. So overall, this shows that there are behavioral factors that can influence the biological course of aging. Next, the authors focus on 3 manifestations of this pivotal position in the life course. So the first one is the intersection of growth and decline. So similar to the idea talked about earlier that many cognitive and physical functions such as speed of processing, memory, lung function, and muscle mass are on a downward path. Things such as happiness, knowledge, experience, and emotion regulation are on an upward path, which puts those in midlife in a very unique, balanced position. Next, the authors talk about the link from earlier to later life, which is midlife. That it's the middle point where early life impacts outcomes in midlife, and then your life in midlife has predictors for later life. So it bridges that gap on an individual level. And then if you look at the last section, bridging younger and older generations, so also bridging the gap within interpersonal, intergenerational relationships. So those in midlife have a meaningful role, often both for their children and then also in helping take care of their parents as they're aging. And this is often referred to as the sandwich generation because they're sandwiched between 2 different generations that they're helping to support. This highlights the importance of those in middle adulthood managing their mental health because it does have the potential to impact so many people, both younger generations and older generations in their life, if these are people that they're caring for. These demanding roles can definitely be stressful, but they can also be extremely rewarding for those in middle age. For example, parents who feel that their children have successfully adjusted after moving out of their home have a higher sense of well-being because they feel they did a good job in their role as a parent. It can also be really rewarding to be the person who bridges the gap between younger and older generations, creating a sense of family solidarity. So overall, the authors of this article portray midlife as a central pivotal period in the life course and one that is relevant to all other life stages. Another article we read was from The Atlantic called The Real Roots of Midlife Crisis, written by Jonathan Rauch. And he talks about how he and many of his friends experienced a lower point of life satisfaction in their 40s, even though on paper everything seemed to be going well for them. Whereas in their 50s, despite new hardships that arose, they were actually happier. So he did research and came across the U curve, which we talked about in the previous article. And that's the idea that in younger years, life satisfaction is high. Then it starts to decline, reaching a low point in the 40s or 50s, and then starts to rise again. And interestingly, it often reaches a higher level in older age than it did in young childhood. Rauch does lots of research and talks to a lot of different people who are well versed in the field while trying to figure out why this U curve occurs. There were lots of arguments that he came across that showed that it was science. So, for example, in one study, it talks about how the U curve emerges only after researchers adjusted for variables such as income, marital status, and employment, which suggests that it's not just life circumstances that contribute to life satisfaction, but it's an underlying pattern that occurs in this life stage. And another example he comes across that points to science is that this drop in life satisfaction also occurs in apes. While he thinks all of this is important and relevant in understanding the U curve, he ultimately argues that culture is what plays the largest role in our idea about midlife. Unfortunately, this leads a lot of people to be pessimistic about their future going into midlife, but people are then pleasantly surprised when they are older and come out of it and see that there is happier satisfaction on the other side.
This article outlined the various ways in which LGBT families are constructed and defined. According to the article, there are still many Americans who are ambivalent or resistant to same-sex households entering the definition of family, which presents a major hurdle for LGBT households. However, the Gallup Daily Tracking Survey estimates that there are 6 million children being raised by LGBT parents, so clearly this is a large and growing segment of the population that is forming families without the approval of heteronormative culture. Same-sex parent families frequently have to push back against legislation for the right to parent. For this reason, scholarly research on child outcomes of same-sex parents receives a lot of attention from the law. In many states, biological parenthood is recognized, but non-biological partners must get second parent adoption status, which is highly variable across jurisdictions. Or, a state may require couples who adopt to be legally married but do not allow same-sex marriage, thereby preventing same-sex couples from adopting. This article does not find any relationship between having a same-sex parent and developmental disadvantages for children, and discredits the validity of such literature as manipulated to produce certain outcomes. Some scholars argue that this issue of best parenting practices shouldn't matter when it comes to same-sex couples, since we don't ask the same questions of straight, heteronormative couples. What the literature does support is that family transitions, regardless of sexual orientation of the parents, can be disruptive to a child's well-being. All of that is not to say that there are no differences between same-sex and different-sex households. Same-sex couple families are significantly more likely to be poor than their different-sex counterparts and are more likely to adopt than their different-sex counterparts. These couples are exposed to more risk in terms of discrimination in social and legal settings. The children of these partnerships and marriages have also reported direct and indirect forms of stigmatization, but lesbian and gay parents have created strategies to confront stigma while retaining the stability of the family unit. It has also been observed that same-sex parents are less worried about gender nonconformity, spend more time on shared interests and activities, and use less corporal punishment. Lesbian households have also demonstrated a more equal division of labor when compared to heteronormative households. The article outlines the 4 most common ways that same-sex partner households come to parent children, which are through a prior relationship with a different sex partner that resulted in the birth of a child or children, through adoption, through the use of assisted reproductive technologies, or by becoming a partner to someone who has done one or more of these things. The article points out that the most common way is to bring existing children from a previous relationship into the family, but that it is becoming more common for planned families to form through artificial insemination, surrogacy, or adoption. Thus, this group has the power to change the definition of what a family looks like. When thinking about how to incorporate this study into our practice, it is important to remember that this population has faced serious and sustained legal attack for many decades. In recent years, the issues over marriage and parenting have become more central to the movement, but are less about granting LGBT couples the right to parent and more about determining who gets custody in divorces between same-sex parents, such as who is more a child's parent, the biological or non-biological parent. This population is highly influenced by macro forces, and the legal realm directs a lot of attention to this group. As we set out to work with families and individuals, we must leave space in our conceptions of family to include households whose structures are outside of straight, heteronormative ideals of two-parent families. Avoid taking the meaning of family for granted. Families come in all shapes and sizes. The beginning of this chapter focuses heavily on adolescent and young adult identity development, so for the sake of time and focusing on our stage of middle adulthood, I'm going to quickly summarize that part and then move on to the second half of the chapter. So in adolescence, an individual's racial, ethnic, cultural identity development may hold anger toward white people. As they move on to college, this development is often marked by immersion in a positive and more well-rounded understanding of their identity. But Tatum also points out that identity development is not unique to college campuses or college-age individuals, pointing to the autobiography of Malcolm X, who explored his racial identity while he was in prison. Afrocentric churches can also provide the space needed for identity development, which has implications for our practice when we think about mobilizing client strengths. At midlife, someone is dealing with physical, psychological, and social changes. Medical diagnosis, changing roles within families, like caring for parents and children, instability with work, and increased community responsibilities, to name a few. Black adults experience stress navigating predominantly white, hostile work environments, especially when they are providing for a family. Tatum explains that Black employees have to manage emotions about racism in the workplace in order to hold on to what they have. For older adults, Tatum describes identity development as circular, like going up a spiral staircase. You may pass through a space multiple times, but will have a different perspective each time. She brings in Parham's concept of identity recycling, where an individual must continually process challenge to one's foundational identity. Erickson calls this re-examination, and people report being more satisfied with their lives if they can do this with integrity rather than despair. This does not necessarily mean it will always be a challenge, but if a Black adult's identity and sense of validation, regardless of class, is based on the approval of white people, there will be inevitable struggle with one's racial identity.
The Evolution of Ethnic Identity from Adolescence to Middle Adulthood is an article that focuses on how second-generation immigrant children go about self-labeling themselves in regards to their ethnic identity. According to prior research done by Feliciano and Rambut, it has been shown that ethnic identities shift considerably from adolescence to early adulthood. However, little is known about how ethnic self-identity development unfolds into middle adulthood. The article describes a study that was conducted in an attempt to further their research and analyze the ties within ethnic identity development from middle adolescence all the way to middle adulthood. The study is composed of a representative sample of immigrant children from Mexico, the Philippines, and other countries such as China and Vietnam were also included. Due to the extremely varied nature of this project and the difficulty to properly derive numeric data, the researchers realized the importance of using mixed method approaches for exploring and analyzing their data. This is why both a survey and a qualitative interview were conducted to gather information. It is important to understand the impact that an identity can have on an individual, especially when it comes to understanding themselves as they progress through adulthood. Ethnic identities provide the ability to invoke subjective feelings of belonging, whether that be within a family or any other group. When it comes to developing personal identities, self-labeling is a widely used dimension. In this study, Rambut and Feliciano, the researchers, are focused on the 4 self-identity labels among U.S. children of immigrants. These include national origin, where someone may describe their ethnic identity as the country that they are originally from; hyphenated, where someone may choose to keep their ethnic origin but hyphenate the title with American. The third is plain or unhyphenated, where an individual may plainly drop their national origin and only identify as American. And the last self-identity label that is referred to in this study is racial or pan-ethnic. And examples of this label include Black, Latino, Hispanic, and Asian. It is important to note that the first two identities resemble a close connection to national origin, whereas the last two relate more to the American present that they are currently living. One of the key differences among immigrant children when it comes to their ethnic identities is due to their generation. There are three main generations which are looked at in this article, and they include the 1.5 generation, which migrated to the U.S. themselves as children, the second generation that was born in the U.S. with two immigrant parents, the 2.5 generation that was born in the U.S. to one immigrant parent and one U.S. born parent. And although these generations play a large role in the ethnic identity label an individual acquires throughout their life, much of the cause can also be derived from experiences with stereotypes, racialization, and their family's colonial history. Another factor that is touched on in this article as being influential when it comes to the process of self-labeling is socioeconomic background. Feliciano and Rambut mentioned that pan-ethnic self-labeling can be seen as associated with a lower socioeconomic background, and that socioeconomic advantaged people, on the other hand, can be seen as more capable of resisting their outside labels. The longitudinal study conducted followed participants for over 20 years, from 1991 to 2016. As stated earlier, the methods used to collect data included surveys and qualitative interviews, both of which were drawn from the original respondents of the Children of Immigrants longitudinal study. This study was composed of both foreign-born and U.S.-born children, with at least one immigrant parent attending 8th or 9th grade in San Diego in 1991. The respondents were surveyed a total of 4 times throughout their lives, beginning in 1991, when the average participant was about 14 years old, all the way to 2016, when the average participant was now about 37 years old. The first 3 times the participants were simply surveyed, and the 4th time the data was collected through a flexible interview format. This allowed for more detail of each person's individual experiences while also collecting standard survey responses comparable to their earlier survey responses. The final results showed that more 1.5 generation and 2nd generation individuals identify in national and hyphenated terms than the 2.5 generation. Therefore, we are able to assume that these generations generally feel a stronger connection to their national origin, even in middle adulthood. Whereas the 2.5 generation, who are born in the U.S. to one immigrant parent and one U.S.-born parent, relate more to the American life that they are currently living. Another important piece of data explains that 53% of respondents who maintain transnational ties are seen as identifying solely with national or hyphenated terms. The results of this study support the finding that the vast majority of foreign-born respondents also identify in national and hyphenated terms. However, by middle adulthood, they are more likely to shift to a plain American or pan-ethnic identity than their U.S.-born peers. During the 4th round of data collection, the interviews revealed that 1.5 generation adults recognize their increasing political and cultural incorporation into American life. This shift was something that was not noted to be as salient for the 2nd or 2.5 generation. Several of the themes that we have previously touched on in this study can be seen as also relating to the reading Brother, I'm Dying. As seen in Brother, I'm Dying, many times families immigrate to a new country, in this instance the United States, in order to seek a better life in regards to lifestyle and socioeconomic opportunities. By experiencing immigration during her adolescent years at only 12 years old, Edwidge's experience supports the idea that identity development begins to shift heavily in adolescence and is solidified later on in adulthood. Immigration and the idea of the American dream are themes that can be seen as overlapping when focused on Danny Katz's Brother, I'm Dying in relation to the development of ethnic identity in middle adulthood. Along with these overlapping themes, two large takeaways from this article regarding the development of ethnic identity include the understanding that this identity shifts most during adolescence and transitions in early adulthood, but stabilizes further into adulthood, which we can see in the study of middle adulthood. The study also reveals the decline of the importance of ethnic identity as adults begin to develop new identities throughout their lives, such as when they become parents, during their jobs as workers, and in relationships with their spouse. One of the last resources that we used to further our research on the topic of middle adulthood was an interactive blog. This blog showcases major considerations for working with the middle adult population, which we know spans roughly from 40 to 60 years old. The resources found throughout the website focus on critical theory and practical implications that come along with working with this population. The blog is broken up into a few major categories. These include exploring the aspects of health, life changes, and relationship dynamics. However, many of the recommendations are mainly centered around physical activity and well-being, maintaining cognition, and social support for caregivers.